The secret to reading ledger line notes is using certain notes as anchor points to visualize the treble or bass staff. Watch the video for my idea about this, and it works great. Had a YouTube video with 180,000 views. It was on for like 9 years, whatever. Anyway, long story short, they could not fix me being able to edit the description. So eventually I said, okay, even though I had 3.9 thousand likes, I zapped it. So it's unlisted. Okay, anyway, so here's the revised version. It really works. And if you find it helpful, please share it with everyone who reads ledger lines, and give me a like, follow, whatever. Okay, here it is. When a composer runs out of lines and spaces on a staff and needs to add notes either below or above the staff, ledger lines are used. At first, it seems to be a daunting task to instantly identify a ledger line note. However, there are a few similarities that, once you understand them, make that process much, much easier. The similarities I'm talking about refer to similar patterns below the bass clef staff and above the treble clef staff. There's an effective way to think of the ledger lines below the treble clef staff and above the bass clef staff. The slow method of identifying a ledger line note is to simply count up or down from the top or bottom note. Now let's look at a much faster way to identify the ledger line notes. Above the treble clef and below the bass clef. Notice that the C above the treble clef has 2 ledger lines. The C below the bass clef also has 2 ledger lines. Middle C, which is in between the bass and treble clef, only has 1 ledger line. So don't confuse this with middle C. These are only the C's above the treble clef staff and below the bass clef staff. So to be clear, on a grand staff, the alphabet direction goes from bottom to top. Notice the top 3 lines above the treble clef staff and below the bass clef staff spell the word ace. Let's try this idea out and figure out what note this is. We know that the C has 2 ledger lines, and it is the center of the word ace. Therefore, this note must be an E. Using the same method, let's figure out what note this is below the bass clef. Again, we know that the anchor note C has 2 ledger lines, and it is the middle of the word ace. So this note must be an A. Let's go back to above the treble clef staff and figure out what note this is. Again, we know that the anchor note C has 2 ledger lines, and it is the middle of the word ace. And we know the next note after E is F. Therefore, our note is an F. Let's practice this method with one more ledger line note below the bass clef staff. What note is this? Again, we know that the anchor note C has 2 ledger lines and is in the middle of the word ace. And we know that our musical alphabet goes from A to G and repeats. So right before the A is G. Therefore, the note is a G. There's an effective way to think of the ledger lines below the treble clef staff and above the bass clef staff. First, let's remember that middle C, which is in between the bass and the treble clef, has only 1 ledger line. A helpful way to think when identifying a ledger line note that is above the bass clef staff is to imagine the treble clef staff lines starting on the very next ledger line above middle C. Let's try this method in identifying this note. We know that middle C is the first ledger line. So the very next ledger line is where we imagine the treble clef staff. Once we visualize that, we can clearly see that this note is an F. Let's identify the next note and get into the habit of visualizing the treble clef staff. Let's identify this note. We know the first ledger line is a C, and we want to visualize the treble clef staff starting on the very next ledger line. That makes it easy to identify our note as an E. If we visualize the treble clef staff in the same way, we can clearly see that the other two notes are an A and a B. The same method works below the treble clef staff. We do this by simply visualizing the bass clef staff, which is one ledger line below the middle C. Let's use this method to identify this ledger line note. We know that middle C has one ledger line, and the very next ledger line is where we imagine our bass clef staff. This makes it easy to identify this note as an E. How about this note? It looks tough and would require a lot of counting with the standard method. But when we visualize our bass clef staff, it's easily identified as a D. It goes without saying that this method will work above the treble clef staff and below the bass clef staff. Just remember that when you visualize the bass or treble clef staff, the bass clef staff starts on the A of ace, and the treble clef staff starts on the E.